This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to talk about semiotics. Now, semiotics is a topic that was suggested by a listener, and I want to thank him very much for that suggestion. As always, I encourage all of you to send in topic suggestions of things you'd like to hear about, and I will try my best to make episodes out of them. This is actually the second episode that's technically a listener suggestion, so thanks to you guys as always. Now, semiotics, what is it and why am I going to talk about it today? Besides it being a listener suggestion, it is very linguistically relevant, and it sort of shares a common ancestor with linguistics, and I'll get into what that means right now. So, Ferdinand de Saussure is somebody who I believe has been mentioned on this podcast before. He is one of the sort of godfathers of modern linguistics, and he was one of the first people to really start playing around with language as an entity. And Saussure came up with a concept that is still very much with us today in linguistics, and it's called the principle of arbitrariness. And so I will start with that, because that is sort of also the basis for semiotics. So Saussure said that you have two things. You have the signifier and the signified, okay, when you have any kind of sign. And the signifier that he was actually referring to at the time is the word. Okay, a word of any language signifies a certain meaning. Okay, so what we have, if you remember back to morphology, we said that a morpheme is the smallest unit of form and meaning. So we have forms which are associated with certain meanings. And for Saussure, these forms were signifiers, and those meanings were the signified. They were referred to by these forms. Now, that's an important fact, because what Saussure said is that there's no particular reason for any particular form to be associated with any particular meaning. That is to say, for any one signifier to necessarily be linked to the signified. Okay, so to sort of illustrate this, consider a word like water. Okay, now the sound pattern that I make, water, so w, a, t, e, r, right? That sound pattern, that morph, is linked to a concept of water that all of you listening right now know, right? You all know what water is, you know water's properties, you know things about water, how water responds to things. You know what water is. You know all about the concept water, so the meaning is certainly there, and the meaning is sort of shared among, certainly for water, among all human beings. However, the word water in English, that particular sound pattern, there's no reason that that is necessarily tied to the concept of water. Okay, so you'll note that if we look at another language like French, and we pull the French determiner off the root, we have O. Okay, that sound, O, which corresponds to water, the concept of water, right? If we look at Spanish, we have agua, and that corresponds to the concept of water. German, Wasser, more similar to water for other linguistic reasons, but Wasser and water are two different sounds, and yet they still correspond to the same meaning. So this is the principle of arbitrariness at work, and at its core is this idea of the signifier and the signified. That crucially, there is no particular reason why the signifier signifies what it does. Right? There's no inherent link. In other words, there is no concept for which every language refers to it the same way. Okay, it doesn't exist. So it stems from this then that signifiers are really what's arbitrary here, because certainly we have shared meanings between languages, but signifiers are not shared. Okay, so signifiers are arbitrary, and thus from that stems that signs can be arbitrarily linked to meanings. Okay, that sort of started thought behind semiotics here, but it took another philosopher by the name of Charles Saunders Peirce to really develop the basis for semiotics. All right, so we're going to switch from Saussure to Peirce, and we're going to see what he said about this idea of signs being linked to meanings. And what Peirce looked at was ways in which the manner of the linkage can vary between different signs. Okay, so this is what he meant. Consider that you have a road sign. In America, we have road signs, of course, that have pictures of people walking, right? A sort of simplified image of, I think, generally a person and a child walking in the direction of a street. Okay, the street being on the left side of the sign itself. And this signifies, without any words, that people can be crossing the street at that particular point. Okay, so the meaning conveyed, this is slightly different from a linguistic sign, right? But the meaning conveyed is that there is an area where people can cross, and it's conveyed by using a picture of people walking. Okay, what Peirce would say is that this was an icon. Okay, and an icon is one of three types of signs according to Peirce. An icon is a sign which is related to a meaning through actual characteristics. Okay, so people crossing would inherently be walking, right? People walking, people crossing, same thing. It just matters where it's happening, right? The sign is an image of people walking, and it signifies that there will be people walking. So this is an iconic sign, okay? The second kind of sign is not related by characteristic directly to the meaning, but is related by characteristic directly to something that in turn is directly related to the meaning. So a good example of this is the skull and crossbones that are classically seen on jars of poison, if you want to think of it that way. Clearly, the poison itself is not made of skulls and bones, but the idea is that if you consume what is in this bottle with this label, that you will turn in to skull and bones. And skull and bones, of course, is what we all become eventually after we die. And so this symbol is what's called indexical. Okay, an indexical sign is related to some concept, which is then related to the actual meaning. So the sign itself shares characteristics with a skull and bones, right? That's a sort of intermediary, because the skull and bones is related to death. So what it's saying in a more roundabout way than an icon is that if you drink this, you will bring yourself death. Okay, that's the idea behind an index. Okay, so far we've had two types. We have an icon and we've had an index. And finally we get to the last sign, and that is the symbol. Okay, now a lot of people think that semiotics is a study of symbols, but in fact that's not entirely accurate, because a symbol is just one of three types of signs, right? Semiotics really is the study of signs and their associations. Okay, now a symbol is the purely arbitrary sign, right? So this is something that is not at all related to its meaning through characteristic. Okay, so you can pick this. Let's say you picked. Well, okay. Here's a good example. You have a green light, meaning go. So the color green is a signifier. It's a sign, and it means something like you're allowed to go when you see the green light. Now, there's no inherent relationship between the concept of going and the color green. This is a truly arbitrary binding here. There's no link between the sign and its meaning through using any characteristics or through using any relation to the word go and then a characteristic that can be linked to green, right? So this is completely arbitrary. Therefore, the green on a stoplight is a symbol. It's a symbol which stands for the meaning you can go, right? What else are symbols? Well, like Saussure said with human language, pretty much any word of any language is a symbol. Okay, it's a symbol because it has an arbitrary linkage between its form and its meaning. So the word water is arbitrarily linked to the concept water, therefore it is symbolic. Agua, o, mizu in Japanese, all these are symbolic for water. Okay? And that's the basic premise behind introductory semiotics, right? So this is the sort of idea, is that you can have different signs may have different manners in which they are related to what they signify. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, if you really extrapolate these concepts out a bit, you do get a lot of interest in semiotics from marketers, right? People that want to advertise things. Because if you realize that there are certain signs which are indexical, that is to say, they're related indirectly to something, but not completely arbitrarily, you can sort of play with these and get a certain reaction out of people by including one of these types of signs in your advertising. So let's consider an advertisement, and I'll explain just briefly how this would work. Let's say you have an advertisement for a new car. It's a billboard. Again, a new automobile. And you've got two things in the billboard. You have the car itself, and you have a person standing next to it with a positive expression on their face. Okay, and forget any wording, any linguistic symbols that are on the billboard, because those are actually less important than any icons or indexes we may have on the billboard. Okay, so let's assume that we just have the car in a garage and a person smiling. Now, a person smiling is interesting because we know psychologically that people will have certain reactions to emotion. And a universal reaction to positive emotion for humans seems to be something like a smile. Okay, so if you see a picture of someone smiling, for humans that is an icon. Okay, because it's not the case that the smile is a natural reaction to any other emotion except for something positive, right? So this can be considered iconic, the picture of the person. Now, when you place the car in the same visual space as that person, what you've done is you've created, overall, a sign which is indexical. What part of it is indexical? The car. Because the car has no relation inherently to happiness. Right? It's not related at all. But the fact that it's in the same sign, the same visual space as an icon for positivity, means that the entire sign itself, the entire billboard, is an index for positivity. Now this is sort of intuitive. Okay, if you see a car and a picture of a smiling guy, you think, oh, they want me to think that that car will make me happy. What semiotics does is it gives you a way to better describe that relationship. Thus the car being an index, well, the whole sign rather being an index for happiness due to this smile being iconic for happiness. And thus the car itself, when you see it in another context outside of the sign, the hope is that some of this meaning that is in that indexical billboard has rubbed off. And so when you see the car, you feel happy. Okay, that's the idea behind these linkages between form and meaning. And that's as far as I'll go on that, because that's already we're sort of outside of the linguistic field, although it is important to see that language certainly is not the only place in which signs are attributed meanings, right? But it is important to know, so going back to linguistics, that all linguistic signs are symbols, okay? Well, almost all. So the last thing I'll say on this is that we do have a certain class of special terms called onomatopoeia. And what are onomatopoeia? Well, they're sounds which are words which are actually approximations of other non-linguistic sounds. Okay, so these are things like bang, boom, things that are supposed to sound like what they relate to. So they signify, the word boom signifies some non-linguistic sound that kind of sounds like boom. Okay, what sound does a chicken make? Well, cock-a-doodle-doo. In English, that's apparently the sound that chickens make. And that particular sound sequence, cock-a-doodle-doo, is supposed to approximate the sound that the chicken actually makes, a non-linguistic sound that the chicken produces. So is this completely arbitrary? Well, no. And that's why they're interesting, right? These are perhaps the only sounds in a language which are not fully arbitrary. They may have some type of characteristic similarity between what they signify. However, it's still the case that even for onomatopoeia across languages, you have different sounds associated with these non-linguistic sounds that they're supposed to approximate. So, for example, cock-a-doodle-doo in English, chickens in Japan apparently go kokoriko, kokoriko. So this is something to keep in mind, right? In language, you never really lose that arbitrariness, right? The principle of arbitrariness is quite pervasive. And so I tip my hat to Saussure for coming up with that one. Anyway, so that has been a brief look, sort of introductory look into semiotics. When you hear somebody say semiotics, now you'll know what to expect, and you'll know what it's all about. Generally, the study of semiotics does turn towards marketing and advertising, like I mentioned here today. Its linguistic importance really past the observation of Peirce and past the principle put forth by Saussure is really minimal, I think. It's necessary for getting the sort of introductory stuff down and realizing why you have variation between languages, certainly. But past that, I think mostly what you find is that it's a visual study, essentially. It deals mostly with visual icons, visual indexes, not really auditory ones, except perhaps with music. But again, it comes back to advertising. Okay. So thank you as always for listening, and once again, I'd like to invite all of you to offer up topics you'd like to hear covered on the Linguistics podcast, either on Twitter @LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Thanks again.